Hi guys, thanks for coming. Let me introduce myself a little bit first. So my name is Artem. I'm originally from Russia. I basically moved to the Bay Area a few months ago, where I work now as a DevOps engineer at IPSI. Before that, I worked in a DevOps consulting company, Express42, in Moscow, Russia, where I did a lot of fun stuff, got a chance to work with a lot of different teams in different companies, did all types of operations works and development, and also was teaching some classes and workshops on DevOps tools and practices. So what I'm going to talk about today, as the name of my talk suggests, I'll be speaking about infrastructure as code. How many of you guys know what infrastructure as code is? All right, awesome. Thank you. I see most of you raised your hand, and that's actually very good, because today I'm not going to talk about what infrastructure as code is. Instead, I'll be talking about how do we better explain the DevOps ideas and infrastructure as code in particular to the people who are, unlike ourselves, completely new to these things. Today, I'd like to share with you guys an open source tutorial that I created in an attempt to make understanding of infrastructure as code a little bit easier for the people and to show why infrastructure as code becomes the standard approach of how we manage our infrastructure today. But before I show you guys the tutorial, I think it's worth explaining why did I bother to create this tutorial in the first place. So there was a couple of reasons that kind of pushed me into creating this tutorial. The first one came from my previous experience of working in a DevOps consulting company. Basically, I saw a lot of cases where people didn't know what infrastructure as code is or felt confused about it. And when I had to explain it to the people, especially to the people who were relatively new to infrastructure management, I felt my explanation was inefficient. And I thought it wasn't because the explanation was bad or there wasn't enough examples. I believed the verbal explanation simply wasn't enough for many people to grasp the idea of infrastructure as code, and a few practical examples or exercises were required. And another thing that I thought kind of made infrastructure as code hard to explain was the fact that it's not limited to one specific tool that implements it. In fact, infrastructure management is such a huge area, and we've got lots of different problems here, and we use lots of different tools to deal with all these types of problems. And what I saw in many tutorials and blog posts that I read, they often talk about infrastructure as code in the context of one specific tool. For example, how Terraform implements infrastructure as code, or how Puppet uses infrastructure as code approach. And this makes it confusing for a person who's trying to learn it, to learn about it, as his understanding of infrastructure as code gets basically tied to that specific tool that he was reading about. So I thought it would be nice to see infrastructure as code to be explained in the context of all these different tools that we use today and not just a single one of them. So I had these thoughts about how can I better explain infrastructure as code to the people so they could easier to understand, so it will be easier for them to understand. But it would all be just thoughts and nothing more if it wasn't for this inspiring man, Kelsey Hightower, and his excellent tutorial, Kubernetes The Hard Way. When I came across this tutorial, I was truly amazed by how great it was written. Even though the tutorial talks about fairly complex stuff, such as bootstrapping a Kubernetes cluster without using any provisioning or Kubernetes or configuration scripts, it does it in such a way that it's very easy to follow. It's short, which automatically doesn't make it boring. And it's practice-oriented, meaning if you want to know how a Kubernetes cluster gets set up, the tutorial is not going to simply give you a description of how this process looks like or give you a script that you have to run one time and it does everything for you. You have to go through all the steps yourself and see how it really works. That's why it's called the hard way. So the Kubernetes The Hard Way was just a lot of fun to read, and after setting up your own Kubernetes cluster from scratch, you get this feeling of excitement that makes you say, damn, I want to learn more about Kubernetes. Well, at least that's the feeling that I got. And in fact, this tutorial seemed so perfect to me that I decided I want to make the same type of tutorial, but about infrastructure as code. And so I did. The tutorial that I created is available on GitHub and has a pretty straightforward name, Infrastructure as Code Tutorial. Anyone who got curious can later find it and check it out. But now let me guys briefly describe the structure of the tutorial and just to kind of share my thinking at the time I was writing it. So in terms of format, the tutorial reminds the Kubernetes The Hard Way. It consists of a set of short labs. The labs are very straightforward and easy to follow. Basically, all you have to do is just copy and paste the commands in the right order. The tutorial is completely free. The Google Cloud Platform free trial is used for creating test environments. And finally, it's open source and available on GitHub, which means anyone can contribute and make it better. Here you can see the list of all the labs the tutorial has. Every lab, except for the first two, introduces the person to either an infrastructure management method or an infrastructure as code tool. Let me now briefly go over the labs and show you how they look like. The tutorial starts with a short introduction. One of my goals was to make a tutorial that even people who have very little experience or non-experience of working with infrastructure, for example, some developers or college students, could easily follow. So I thought it would be good to create a story for this tutorial to make it kind of easier for these people to understand what this infrastructure management is all about and why they should learn about it. And so the story for this tutorial gets described in the introduction. The story goes like this. I asked to imagine a simple case when you, the reader, created a web application and you're super excited about it and can't wait to show it to the internet users. But then you ask yourself a question. How do you actually make your application available to all the millions of your imaginary users? You obviously need far more capacity than your local machine to achieve that. And so you start realizing that writing the code was only part of the problems that you had to solve, and you still face a lot of new challenges that you know nothing about and which kind of rise like a wall of confusion in front of you. But lucky for you, there is often a person on the other side of this wall who knows how to run applications. And so what you typically do, you throw your code over that wall and hope the person on the other side will catch it and make it work for you. But in my introduction, I suggest instead of throwing the code over that wall, actually try and jump over that wall and see what's going on the other side. This is how the tutorial kind of begins. The person gets introduced to the problems of running applications. When a person doesn't know anything about running applications, according to the story of this tutorial, I think the best way for him to start would be not to dive straight into Ansible, Terraform, and all these fancy tools, but first do everything manually one time, step by step, just to see how the process of running an application looks like. That's why following a short introduction goes the lab about manual operations. I basically give the reader a test application, which is already written, so the person doesn't need to write any application code himself, and ask him to run it in the cloud. So the person in this lab has to launch a virtual machine, set SSH keys, firewall rules, install application dependencies on the remote machine, and deploy the code. Again, everything is done manually, step by step, just so that the person could get an understanding of some of the common things that we have to do in order to run applications. In each of the following 4 labs, the reader will repeat the exact same steps he did in this lab, but in every lab, we will try to improve this manual process by using different methods and, of course, infrastructure as code tools. So in the next lab, we start looking for the easiest way to improve this manual process. And the most obvious way to improve this manual process when you don't know yet about infrastructure as code is by using bash scripts. So in this lab, the person has to group the commands that he ran on the instance into scripts and repeat the exact same steps he did in the previous lab. That is to spin up a virtual machine, install application dependencies, deploy the code. But this process starts to look a little bit easier now, since we have to run less commands thanks to scripts. I also try to explain to the reader that by introducing scripts into our workflow, we start standardizing the process of how we configure environment for our application, because all the required commands are now defined in files and not just live in someone's head. Starting from this lab, we also begin to use Git. After every lab, the person has to commit the work that he did to the local repository. This way, I kind of try to make people get used to using source control tools for the code that defines our infrastructure, and to show that the infrastructure code is no way less important than the application code. Then we move on to the infrastructure as code tools, and we start with Packer. It seemed very easy for me to explain what Packer does and why we need to use it, because the person has in fact already seen the benefits of using it. In the first lab, when we did everything manually, before we could clone the application code from GitHub onto our remote virtual machine, we had to first install Git. And it turned out that the Ubuntu image that the Google Cloud provides already has Git pre-installed. Therefore, we could skip that step and had to run less commands. That's why all I do in this lab is just to remind the person about that case and say how cool it would be if our image had all the required packages pre-installed and not just Git. This way, the process of system configuration would go even faster and easier. So in this lab, the person builds his own image using Packer and the script that he wrote in the previous lab. Then he commits his Packer templates to the local Git repo and now has all the information about his base image codified. In the next lab, we start seeing a problem with spinning up virtual machines and changing firewall rules using web UI and command line utilities. If we were to work in a team and manage a bit more complex infrastructure with, let's say, tens or hundreds of servers, it would be hard for us to control what changes are happening in our infrastructure and why are they happening. That's why in this lab, we decided to codify the state of our infrastructure using Terraform and keep the infrastructure code in source control so we can track all the changes that are happening. Then we again look at the same process of setting up infrastructure for our application and decide to get rid of bash scripts and replace them with Ansible playbooks. I explained that configuration management tools like Ansible provide a simpler and more reliable interface to doing common operations tasks, such as configuring the system and deploying the code. So by the end of this lab, we completely replace our manual process that we had in the beginning with infrastructure as code tools. Now we build a machine image with the required system configuration using Packer. Then we launch a virtual machine with Terraform and configure firewall rules again by using Terraform. Finally, we deploy our application with Ansible. As a result, we not only reduce the amount of commands that we have to run, but we also now have a codified description of how infrastructure for our test application should look like, which could be compared to the architectural plan of this little house on this slide. The tutorial could have probably ended right here after we completely transformed the way we run our application in the cloud using infrastructure as code tools. But I also decided to bring the person's attention to how we manage our local infrastructure. That's why in the next lab, I talk about how we need to make our local dev environments consistent across all the developers who work on the application, and also to make it look similar to our remote production environment, so we avoid situations when the application works on my machine but doesn't work in staging or production. So we use Vagrant and Ansible to describe our local dev environment and make it repeatable, isolated from our host system, and look like our remote production environment. The last thing that I kind of wanted to show in this tutorial was how infrastructure as code is used when we work with containers, which become more and more popular nowadays. That's why in the following labs, I talk about Docker and how we can use the Docker file mechanism to define through code the running environment for our application. So we containerize our test application, but when running containers locally, we also notice that it takes us a lot of commands to start containers, configure a network, and create volumes. Thus, we also decide to codify our local dev environment by using Docker Compose. And then I also introduced the reader to the popular orchestration platform, Kubernetes, that is used to run containers at scale. In this lab, we deploy a Kubernetes cluster using Terraform and Google Kubernetes Engine, and see how by defining Kubernetes objects through manifests, we can run our application across multiple Docker hosts. Finally, to conclude this tutorial, in the last lab, I summarized some of the key points about infrastructure as code, which should now be easy for the reader to understand after going through all this adventure to the world of operations and infrastructure management. So this is how, in short, the tutorial looks like. And To kind of end my presentation, I would like to say a few words about how do I view this tutorial. First of all, this tutorial is an open source initiative. I started it in an attempt to make understanding of infrastructure as code a bit easier for the people, but it doesn't mean it's a complete tutorial and cannot be changed. If anyone finds ways to explain some things better or finds mistakes, I would really like to see other people contributing to this tutorial. Also, if you guys like me ever experience troubles explaining to the people what infrastructure as code is, or why do we use tools like Terraform or Chef, this tutorial can become a link that you can simply reference to answer these questions. And finally, this tutorial could simply be a good resource for anyone who wants to learn about DevOps, as since infrastructure as code is one of the key concepts people should know about. Yeah, I guess that's it. Here's the link to the tutorial and my contact information. I would like to hear your feedback and any thoughts you may have about this tutorial. Feel free to send me a message or come talk to me. I'll be at this conference today and tomorrow. Yeah, thanks for coming again.